Our guest today is someone who's been quietly crushing it across corporate and creative worlds. She somehow manages to juggle more in a day than most of us do in a week. Ambika Pandey is currently at Setu in a product role, but that's just one slice of what she does. She's also part of Atrium Angels, an ISB focused angel fund, and she's grown quite a bit of following on LinkedIn for her in depth take on the latest fintech trends. Ambika's career has zigzagged in the best possible way. She dove headfirst into fintech, post her MBA at ISB, and never looked back, working with players like Zestmoney and Razorpay across different roles. But before that, she was smashing serves and chasing titles as a competitive tennis player. She was ranked in the top 10 in India under 16, under 18, and held a global junior ranking of 194. She won several tournaments as a professional tennis player, like the Canadian Open, ITF Junior Tournament, and multiple others on the AITA circuit. In this episode, we discuss with Ambika on several topics like fintech trends, how one can break into fintech industry, growing a voice on LinkedIn, her life as a former tennis pro, can one have a career in sports today, and finally the eternal mystery, which is how on earth she manages to multitask without losing her mind. We hope you find this episode insightful. Here's Ambika Pandey.
Hi there, Ambika. Glad you could make time for this podcast. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, appreciate you folks reaching out.
Perfect, perfect. So, without any further delay, let's dive right in. So, Ambika, for our listeners, we first want to start on exploring the fintech career that you have had post ISB. And you have already worked with three major fintech players Zestmoney, Razorpay, and now Setu. To an outsider, it seems like a pretty stellar career in fintech so far. So, our natural curiosity is what actually drew you to fintech post ISB? And once you were in the industry, what clicked that made you stay?
Understood. So, like it is a happy accident that I actually got into Zest Money. It was part of placements, and at ISBM, we were sitting, you know, at least interviewing with multiple companies. So, out of the offers I got, Zest Money seemed the most exciting. Like, I like the culture, I like what the team was trying to build, and it felt like they were sitting at the cusp of, innovation, but at the same time, they're actually doing something which is benefiting a lot of people, right? So, that sweet spot I felt is what Zest Money was working in. And then as I got deeper into fintech, that's at least what fintech became for me, where you work on a lot of cool things, you work on a lot of, maybe industry defining things. But at the same time, it's not just innovation for convenience, it's actually unlocking something like financial inclusion or, making payments easier, enhancing people's access to their own data. So that's how it really started, almost by accident. And then when I was at Zest Money, at least the my once I got more excited about fintech, for me, the BNPL use case was still very small. I wanted to sort of expand the stuff in fintech I was exposed to. And Razorpay was obviously a company, by India, for India, all of that. And it was anyway around. So it was anyway a company I was keen to work for. So when an opportunity came up, I immediately sort of joined there, but more in a strategy role. So in Zest Money and Razorpay, they were more strategy founders office. So, working on things which were top of the mind for founders. It could be some internal optimization, or it could be some sort of market expansion or new product strategy or things like that. And then as I sort of kept working, I was in the strategy role at Razorpay for about a year and a half. I actually realized that fintech is very technical, right? And to actually have that dragonfly view, you need to understand the fundamentals very well. And in a lot of the new companies that are now being built, it's very product first. So to actually get that visibility on how the flow actually works to build that intuition. So that's once you have that intuition, that's when you can predict in 5 years and say, hey, this will be disrupted because these are the inefficiencies in the current system. That I feel even in a strategy role, you don't really get. And that's why I shifted to a product role within Razorpay and did that for about a year at Razorpay. And then, realized that, hey, I do have an understanding about what Razorpay does, which is more on the fintech payment aggregation side. wanted to expand my horizons a little bit. And for me, data is a very exciting space to be in, right? I feel like data right now is where maybe payments, UPI, etc. was 3-4 years ago. And yeah, got an opportunity at Setu. It had been a company that I'd been hearing a lot about. They do a lot of work in the payments infra space. And yeah, when I got an opportunity, I switched. So yeah, that's basically how my fintech journey has been.
Very interesting. So, Ambika, like now that you have already given us a brief on your transition from Zest Money to Razorpay to Setu, now we are curious about how your day in your life is like at Setu. What are your responsibilities? What are the nature of challenges that you tackle while you're working at Setu?
Right. For context, Setu was acquired by Pine Labs a few years ago, but it still operates as a separate entity. So it does have the benefit of being under the Pine Labs brand, but at the same time, it still operates very like a startup. So the challenges that come with it are, very startup-y types, right? That, you still have a lot of process optimization that you need to do, but the energy is great. There are a lot of new problems you need to solve, a lot of new things that are coming, a lot of brainstorming, a lot of pivots. So I'd say, I mean, tough to define a day in a life. I'd say at least as a product manager, you get up every day, you look at your, data, the data stat, you make sure nothing's broken or things are performing the way they are. You join your daily stand-ups where you at least get an update on, where we are. Are we on track to deliver some things? Do we have to do some reprioritization? And then it really depends on what the priorities for the day are. So it could depend, right? It could be that, hey, in this week, I want the team to at least start working on a specific product or a feature. So if there's any documentation or research or anything you need to write about that, maybe set up calls, you do that. It could be that you've got a bunch of client meetings, right? It could be QBRs, or it could just be weekly or monthly check-ins, giving them an update about how things have gone. So you prep for that. It could be even in, again, a product first company, the product folks get involved in almost every aspect. So it could be even speaking to the sales team, figuring out, what the pricing strategy is. Do we have to optimize anything? So really depends. There have been days I've had where the whole day I've just spent working on a document, doing my own research. There've also been days where I've just had back-to-back meetings from, getting into a sales call or getting into a partnerships meeting. There's a last minute discussion with a client that I've been sort of got into and said, okay, you need to give a product perspective or you have to answer some questions. Something's broken at night. So you get on a call at 7 p.m. and try to figure out what the issue is. So yeah, tough to define. I think it's more structured in a bigger company. It's a little more unstructured, yeah, but I find I actually like the 0 to 1 energy. I like that. It's I would not say it's more like controlled chaos, which I genuinely enjoy.
It's an interesting perspective you brought towards the end. And Ambika, I mean, so a lot of people who have been reaching out to us asking how they can break into the fintech industry. So for an outsider, I mean, someone who's trying to switch mid-career, let's say, what are some of the profiles or what are some of the career paths that they can explore in fintech? And how I want you to explain the answer is the career paths and also the type of skill sets or the type of, background that can realistically help a person transition into those routes.
So see, it depends the type of role you want to get into. If it's more um if it's more sales or business or maybe a supporting function, I do think the basics remain the same, right? Like at the end of the day, sales is not that different. It's just you obviously have to have that basic product understanding, but apart from that, the even in a product role, right? The basic skill set is the same. I'd say how it's evolved now is that instead of looking for generalists, which I think was the case maybe 4-5 years ago, a lot of folks are looking for people who already come in with some background, right? In it doesn't have to be fintech, it could be even fintech adjacent. But you do have to have some understanding of how the system works. And it just helps you to ramp up that much quicker, right? I think that has been one major change, going from that generalist to sort of specialist role where you're looking for people to come in and immediately start adding value. It's not that in 3-4 months, they get the context, they figure out how things work, and then they start giving inputs. I'd say in the age of AI, it's become a lot easier to get this context. I think the biggest thing that's helped me is actually and even this role at Setu, right? What's really helped me is actually putting myself out there, doing a lot of writing. I find that that's been the best way to actually get a lot of inputs from folks, right? I've had so many people cold reach out and say, hey, I didn't understand this. Can you explain this better? Or even some folks who reach out and say, hey, this is wrong. I don't think you've got it right. And there I maybe get on a call or have like a just a discussion over LinkedIn chat or even WhatsApp with them and say, hey, what do you think I got wrong? But you know, that's sort of enhanced my understanding. But that's also, I think, word of mouth travels fast, right? So it's sort of made me into a person where folks will message me and say, hey, I spoke to this person. They had good things to say about you. You seem to understand or you seem to explain it well. So really breaking in now, I think, is to like build your network, position yourself as somebody who at least is thinking about things in the right way, right? And that doesn't necessarily have to be fintech specific, right? Tomorrow, if you want to break into something else, something within e-commerce, let's say, I would prescribe the same steps. It's just that the subject that you're discussing becomes different.
And of course, I think Ambika, what you have been writing and sharing with the audience at large is something we'll be exploring further down in the podcast. But now that you have mentioned about various different aspects of the industry, I'm curious to know, I mean, especially with Gen AI disrupting each and every space, uh, how do you see, what are some of the exciting areas in fintech where you imagine seeing growth in the next 3 to 5 years?
So I think couple of places is one is the whole DPI piece, right? The digital public infra. I think UPI 1.0 with just has the payment, right? The basic payment rails that I think has scaled wonderfully. I think the next step of innovations, at least in UPI, at least, will be the value added services on top of it, right?
Hmm.
Um, Things that haven't really been solved yet, but things like international transactions on UPI. There was a concept called UPI plugin that was launched and I think is in the process of scaling. Other ways of, authentication right now is just pin based, so biometric stuff like that. So value added layers upon the rails that have sort of built and scaled. I think the same thing is happening in things like the account aggregator network, right? Uh, it'll sort of continue to evolve, the customer experience, etc., will get better. But that is another, I think, very exciting space. uh at least in fintech, the other two places I see actually will grow in the next couple of years is, things around privacy. Just with the whole DPDP Act coming in at some point get enforced. It's not really fintech, but I would classify it as fintech adjacent just because I think the biggest source of information about anybody is like their financial footprint, right? Which sits with banks. So if banks are involved, there's going to be some sort of fintech angle there. And I also think cross border is going to explode, right? And I'd break it down into two categories. One is your cross-border flow in the current system, right? Where you have your acquiring, issuing bank, the payment rails, you have your banks. But the other really exciting space that's blowing up is stable coins. So I think at least across this, right, your DPI, your value-added services on top of DPI, the privacy space, cross-border and stable coins are at least four areas I think are really going to blow up in the next few years.
But aren't these the areas where there is heavy regulatory kind of pressure? Don't you think that could be like a key headwind?
So it will. See, the thing is, I don't think regulations necessarily are bad. I actually think they're good because it's tougher for a company to operate in a gray area and not know what's going to come in the next day and immediately stop your growth, right? Or immediately shut down your business, which is what happened with Zest Money actually a few years ago. They were operating in this sort of gray area. And then the digital lending guidelines came in, and then immediately your Slice, Jupiter, Zest Monies of the world all had to see, okay, how do we restructure our business to make sure that we're not, really going against what these regulations are saying. So it will be slow. I'm not saying it won't be, but I think at least in the case of UPI, a lot of the rails have already been laid, right? So a lot of the regulations have already come out. Now building on top of it is not super hard because the regulations now have already sort of laid a path on what you can do and what you can't do. And I think that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. So where I'm coming from is, if you look at especially the remittances, right? With the volatile kind of macro environment, uh, you know, most recently what we got to know is, um, Trump has announced like 5% tax on NRA remittances. So that can come from anywhere, any day. So how should one adapt to that as a company? And you think there's something that can be done to adapt to these kind of, spikes?
See, it's very tough to predict all of this. I think some things you can predict. So some things that are predictable are things that you can anyway look at the trends and make sure that, hey, this is where the industry is going. So this is what I need to build. Some things like this, like Trump coming in and putting tariffs or saying, hey, now I'm putting some sort of tax on remittance and things like that. It's very hard to guard against. I mean, my view here is you just sort of hope for the best, make sure that at least you have enough streams of business that can at least hold you through until all of this stuff sort of clears up. But I think that's something that at least a lot of fintechs are doing anyway, right? And at least fintech in India has evolved more into a full stack play. There are very few companies who have only one stream of business. Even if you look at cross border, yeah, sure, they may be doing cross border, but it won't be just focused on one corridor. It may be focused on other corridors as well. So you're sort of hedging your bets there. But yeah, to answer your question, very hard to guard against stuff like this, honestly.
Makes sense. No, diversification, I think, is going to be one of the key strategies, right? Yeah. Fair.
I was thinking from perspective of people who are very new to these areas of growth, who may not have as much context in terms of what's really happening. So the growth areas that you have mentioned, can you break them down into like very layman terms for the audience, in terms of for them to be able to appreciate and understand how fintech is evolving?
Right. So, uh, I mean, UPI, I think there's not too much explanation needed, but basically real-time account-to-account payments, right? Before this, there was no UPI is basically come in and taken the role of what cash or debit cards were doing, which was cash was very unstructured, very, very inconvenient, right? And the other way, at least, were debit cards, which were running on your MasterCard and Visa rails and very expensive, right, to the end user. The MDR at least was 2%, and that was passed on to the customer. What at least real time payments have come in, you've made it free, you've made it mobile first. Automatically, with the smartphone penetration, cheap internet, almost everybody who has a phone can now do digital payments. The issue with doing digital payments was never that people didn't want to be online, right? It was just that all of these, uh, you know, process problems of going to a bank, getting a debit card issued, remembering your PIN, all of that. The the place that you're paying at needing those POS machines, right? All of that was a very complicated, very, very tedious process. Now anybody has a phone can just scan a QR which has been printed from somewhere and just pin to the shop's wall and can immediately pay. So I think that what a UPI has done actually to make life very easy, I had to dumb it down, is just use what people already have and just made it very convenient, right? You've broken down the access barriers. Now, the thing with UPI is it's just another form of payment. What has not been solved on top of it, and you can equate it to something like cards, is, things like reward points, things like revolving credit that used to come with like a credit card. So, those are the things which will actually, in very layman's terms, think of almost taking the card experience, all the value added services that cards bring, and putting it on UPI rails. So, if you just look at UPI as a cash payment, what you would need on top of it is rewards. You need, like I said, revolving credit or a credit line, which hasn't really taken off yet, right? You'd need some sort of EMI. You can even have things like, alternate authentication. MasterCard and Visa are experimenting with biometric based passkey, stuff like that. So, taking up all of that, putting it on UPI, that's where, at least in a very layman's terms, that's how the ecosystem will actually evolve. That's how you shift all the or majority of the transactions that are happening on cards on UPI, right? Which has already started to happen. That's at least on the UPI front. Um, with cross border and stable coins, so it's a little more complex. So let me see how I can dumb it down. But when you're doing cross border payments, right? I would right now, there's not really a solve, at least in the real time payments world, for it. While uh, our NPCI, which is the body that launched UPI, while we've done integrations with, I think, 7 odd countries with their equivalent of UPI. I think Singapore, Malaysia, UAE, all of that, it's still yet to be expanded across the globe. The reason for that is that it's not as easy as it seems. Essentially, if you look at UPI as rails that are connecting the merchant with the customer bank in very at its base. To do this at a global level, your real-time payments rail, which is UPI, has to be integrated with the country's equivalent, right? So if I look at Brazil, which has Pix, which is the biggest, maybe, which is a competitor to UPI in terms of scale, the Pix system would have to be integrated with UPI system, right? That's a mammoth task. It's really not that easy. So that'll take some time. Until that happens, the existing systems that we have for cross-border payments are basically your cards, because your MasterCard and Visa have built those global rails, right? Those still are pretty inefficient. The reason for that is because there are multiple systems that operate in silos. It can take a lot of time, right? So at every step, you have to do authentication. At every step, you have to do some sort of reconciliation. You have to do customer and merchant checks. So at least the end-to-end, the money transfer, the settlement cycle can be in days, right? It can take up to 7 days, at least 2-3 days. So it'll take. There'll also be multiple intermediaries, right? So let's say if I'm transferring money from bank X and I want it to maybe go to bank Y, to actually do that transfer, it's possible that my bank has not done an integration with that bank. So then we will have to find a bank in the middle that's connected to both banks. So the money, I will send it to that intermediary bank, which has a connection with me and bank Y. Then that money will go from, because they have the connection to bank Y, then it will flow. So there's another step, right? You add another step, you add more process inefficiencies. So that's at least the way the current cross-border payment rails are structured. And there are ways for fintechs to come in and actually reduce these steps, right? And that is at least what folks, at least that is one thing that the PACB license is doing already, right? Before the PACB license came in, the bank had to sort of lead all this, own the merchant relationships and things like that. The PACB coming in puts more onus on the fintech, where the fintech can own those merchant relationships, the fintech can actually hold money and maybe own and innovate on more of the flows. It comes with more liability, but that's not really a bad thing. But the systemic issues remain, right? Where you still have multiple hops. The fintech may come in and reduce those hops, but at the core of it, you'll still have systems operating in silos. Stable coins will come in, and that's where the massive innovation is, and that's what I'm super excited about. Stable coins come in and essentially remove all of these hops. So if you think about blockchain, think of blockchain as a massive network, and every operating system is plugged into the same blockchain or the same network. So essentially, everybody is just a small system operating as part of a big system. When that happens, right, and also one key feature of blockchain is the distributed ledger technology, where when a transaction happens, that transaction is basically locked into an identical copy of the ledger that every system that's plugged into the blockchain has, right, in real time. Because of that, you don't have to keep doing reconciliation, you don't have to go back and forth, you don't have to keep doing verifications. Money transfer that would take days can now take seconds, because it can almost instantly be done because everybody is on the same network, right? So I don't know, I think it was sort of a long-winded answer, but I hope that made sense to you guys.
So moving on, Ambika, like talking specifically in terms of role of Gen AI, uh, what areas do you feel among these are the ones that will have the maximum impact of Gen AI, and how do you see Gen AI shaping the growth in fintech?
So I think and I'd love to actually hear your views also. I'm still on the fence about how Gen AI will help fintech specifically. I think it'll be more in terms of functions. I do think there's a lot of scope, at least in your customer support. There is a lot of scope in optimizing a lot of your manual ops processes. A lot of this will have to be tailored because workflows are different in a fintech versus a healthcare versus a pharma versus e-commerce and all of that. I definitely think there are use cases in Gen AI around personalized journeys, or things like just being able to use your financial information better to understand which product would be best for you. even in cases like underwriting and things like that. But like it's a fine line at the end of the day. I'm still not too confident about, some sort of AI tool having access to all of this data. At the end of the day, I have to feed in all of this data to get those insights out, right? So I think somewhere that fine line between being able to use Gen AI to actually optimize a lot of this and privacy needs to be drawn. But yeah, I would love to hear your folks' views on this. I'm still on the fence if how this will actually help, apart from just your general, manual processes and things like that.
Yeah, so I can go first, right? And I can talk about it from healthcare pharma angle. The key areas where, as we talk about it, the key areas getting affected are, one is content. And when I say content, uh, when you reach out to HCPs, healthcare providers, pharma companies, you need to generate personalized content. So that is where Gen AI is making an impact. Of course, all the content that you generate needs to be vetted. But yes, at least the first steps, right? That's one area where Gen AI is making an impact. The other one is customer service. It's more about understanding the next best action, right? Now, let's say if a sales representative goes to the HCP, now for the sales representative, you need to feed in a lot of data points to understand, okay, what the HCP wants to talk about, what kind of drugs the HCP prescribes, so on and so forth. And basis that, what should be the next action? Now, again, there, Gen AI to some extent is making an impact, but of course, across a pharma value chain, if you look at it, right, starting from clinical, medical, commercialization, there are certain use cases where, Gen AI is making its impact. But top of my mind, these are the use cases that I can think of.
Yeah. And do you think at least it'll become, I mean, you'll still have overall the same, it's still solving the same use case, but you'll have to obviously tailor it for your specific function or your specific industry.
Absolutely, yes. So the data that you feed in, right? The context, the intent that you would want to, all these would come from the very specific set of data points. It needs to be tailored to your own function. I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, understood. No, that's why I'm trying to think about it as well, because there's at least so much of discussion, right, on Gen AI and fintech, and you got a lot of these companies coming in and saying, "Hey, we'll whatever get access to your data, and we'll be able to give you personalized information." So there are a couple of interesting companies that I spoke to who said that, "Hey, we'll at least build some sort of, let's say, we'll get access to customer data through an account aggregator, and we'll build some sort of Gen AI or LLM chat on top of it." And you'll actually be able to get very very specific advice on what you need to do. So it'll almost be like, hey, I want to buy an iPhone which is worth whatever 80,000. What's the best way I can optimize my finances to do that? And because this AI has access to all of your information, it'll actually say, okay, pay off this loan or take this EMI and put money in this fund, because you'll get, so it can do all of that stuff and sort of give you an output. uh but I don't know, like, how much comfort I have with something like that, having access to so much of my information is something I'm still trying to
So
figure.
that's one important factor, right? The other one is in highly regulated areas, especially some parts of the fintech and more so in pharma space, right? Gen AI is considered more like a black box, and therefore you're bound to, come up with certain hallucinations, and therefore these areas, if you look at it, uh, they tend to be laggards in adopting innovation. Because ultimately, if you look at pharma, you're dealing with the lives of patients, and therefore, if there are any hallucinations that are involved, then that would mean that the lives of patients would get affected. And therefore, yes, there needs to be certain guardrails defined to minimize the hallucination, something like human in the loop, right? So that they can correctly vet it and then take it forward. But ultimately, these are some of the use cases that I see, coming into play.
Understood. Europe's data laws around this are actually pretty good, and something that maybe the DPDP needs to come with. So I think with Europe, their laws actually give you the right to actually opt out of any automated decision making, or at least have the right to know. The issue right now is with Gen AI being layered, I think, in India also. A lot of times I don't even know the information you're taking from me, what you have, what information you have access to. And second, how you actually feeding this in. You're probably doing some sort of automation, but I have no knowledge of what data you're using, what rules you're using, and then it's spitting out some sort of score which says, okay, she should get this product at this rate or not. So I think that human in the loop thing that you mentioned, right, is very valid, because that is, I think, that is implicit, at least in Europe's laws, where I can very clearly get up and say, hey, I don't agree to this. I have not given my consent that you can just use my data and automate some sort of decision. I should know if it's happening, and I should have the right to say, no, I'm not okay with it. So,
Yeah, so just adding on to that, right? So I kind of agree the data laws in Europe are a bit more stringent when you look at other geographies, including US, right? And I see that firsthand because when you're targeting HCPs for HCP engagement, in the US geography, you can target at the HCP level. Of course, some of the personal details would be masked, but at least you can target, you'll get to know what the HCP is up to at an individual level. But that is not the case with Europe. You can't just do that. So that itself kind of goes to say that the data laws in Europe are a bit more stringent.
yeah, completely agree.
Great. So moving on, Ambika, you've gathered quite a bit of following on LinkedIn for your fintech related posts, right? So just wanted to understand what pushed you to start writing in public and why fintech especially.
Right. So, honestly, I actually started writing as a way to just get my thoughts in order. So, especially when I moved to Razorpay, right? Razorpay, being a full stack fintech, was doing so many different things, and especially as a part of the strat team, genuinely you're involved in like 4 to 5 different projects across different, themes. So it was at least a lot of information coming at me, especially at the start, and I actually just started making notes on like a Google Doc just as a way to keep track and make sure I'm understanding what I'm doing, right? And making sure that the fundamentals are there at the end of the day. And at some point, this writing started evolving into like a fully blown sort of opinion piece, right? And that's something at least a lot of us try to do, especially in the strat world, where we say, okay, where is this evolving? Somebody's done this. What does this mean? So that's how the writing started evolving. And it was mainly a way to just for me to learn about something and go really deeply into it. And at some point when I started writing these really long form articles, I was like, hey, might as well just put it out there and see what happens. And to be honest, was pretty nervous, at least, about putting myself out there. I did not expect it to at least get the following it did. I guess there is, I think, a lack of people writing, maybe some of these more complicated concepts in a simple way, or trying to explain it, in a very detailed sort of fashion. And yeah, that's how it started. And when I at least started getting some traction, I was like, okay, it seems that there are a lot of people out there like me who want to learn more about this, and at least it's resonating with them. So then used it as a way to, deep dive on things that I want to know more about. And at least because fintech's an area that really interests me, kept that as a core theme. Started adding some other things around sports once in a while about AI and things like that. But even AI actually started because I was just like, hey, I need to know more about it. And the only way I can really hold myself accountable and say, hey, let's really deep dive and understand, if I say, hey, let me put something out there. Because if I'm putting myself out there, then my research has to be good. I have to communicate it and understand it in a way that if people come back with questions, I'm at least able to have an opinion on it. So yeah, that's really how it started. And I don't know how so many people at least have started following and enjoying the content I put out.
Yeah, and why fintech especially though? Is that because that was your line of work, or is there any other reason apart from that?
So started off as a line of work. And then somewhere I think I genuinely actually fell in love with fintech and really enjoy, learning more about at least not just how payments work, but how everything else in fintech is evolving. It is something that I enjoy reading about even when I'm not working. Yeah, that's really it.
Great. So we will get to the inside part as to how you pick the topic, so on and so forth, right? But first, what were the outcomes like? What were some of the best compliments that you received? Can you maybe throw some light on that?
Yeah. So I think one major outcome is one, I've become a lot more confident about how I'm maybe seeing things or how I'm building an opinion, right? A lot of the stuff that I try to write about is sort of, hey, this has happened. So this is what I see happening, right? And a lot of these things, at the end of the day, I try to keep my research and my articles very data driven. I like to keep data and trends at the center of it and then draw maybe some sort of conclusions from there. What has been really good is I think a lot of people have enjoyed the fact that one, it's very data driven, right? I think a lot of the pieces right now on LinkedIn are you give a summary about something and that's it. Nobody's really said, hey, this is the data and this is what it's telling me. And that's why I think, this will happen or I've drawn this conclusion. I think that at least about fintech specifically is missing. So, just people reaching out and saying, hey, I love the way you at least weave data into a narrative, and give like a conclusion is really helpful. The second thing I've really, I think, been quite proud of, at least this compliment, is that a lot of people have given me the feedback that, I write with an opinion. I think a lot of folks, at least even when they write, are maybe afraid of putting themselves out there and saying, hey, this is my opinion and I think this will happen. Right? It's not easy. It can be a little nerve wracking because when you come out with an opinion, you're also setting yourself up in a way that people can come in and say you're wrong. And that's also happened. But more often than not, at least, I want, when people read my stuff, I want them to at least take away a hypothesis or take away, a point of view from it, not just read a summary and say, this is what's happening in the world. And I've actually got a lot of feedback saying that, we like that you write with an opinion. We like that once I read your piece or article on LinkedIn or even on Substack, we take away the fact that this is what you think will happen. So that's been really good. I think I really enjoy hearing that. And at least on Substack, some of my articles are a little dense. They can take maybe 10-15 minutes to go through, and you probably have to reread them to actually understand it. Some of them are a little more technical. But the fact that people actually taking that time out to read it, understand it, comment on my post, even sending me a LinkedIn message saying, hey, I really enjoyed it. Thank you for sharing. Uh, all of that's super. I mean, I try to respond to as many of them as I can, but genuinely quite overwhelmed when people take the time out and actually look forward to some of the stuff I put out. But yeah.
Got it. So how do you deal with critics, right? Has there been a case where, people have pointed it out that you've been wrong, and has there been a case where you've changed your opinion?
So I think in terms of my opinion, that doesn't change. So at least the putting out a piece or putting out an opinion article is a bit, it takes some time, right? I don't just turn it around in a couple of days. Or it can be like a 3 to 4 week process for me to actually finalize on the topic and do all the research, speak to people, get my own thoughts in order. So the opinion or the hypothesis doesn't change. More of the critiques usually are that, hey, maybe this calculation or the way you've estimated this is wrong, right? Some of the assumptions that you've taken are not correct. Or, hey, your understanding of how you've imagined this specific payment flow may be wrong, right? Some of the pieces I've written is, at least in a future, the cross-border payment flows or in a world of stable coins, this is how the roles of different entities could change, right? So some people have come back to me and said, hey, this won't work because this will happen, or hey, you've got maybe this estimation wrong, or this is incorrect, and things like that. But what I've been at least quite appreciative of is, nobody sort of come out and blown it up on LinkedIn, and how you've got some of these folks who just take a screenshot and repost and say, hey, this is wrong. I think people have been able to see that, hey, my heart's in the right place. I'm making an effort to actually do as much research as I can. And where, there have been cases where somebody's come back to me and said, hey, you've maybe not thought about this correctly, or this flow is wrong. And I've taken that feedback and, made that change and thanked them. And I think that at least for them is probably a good outcome as well, right? Somebody sort of heard their feedback, come back, responded in a polite fashion. I think there are a lot of folks who probably don't take criticism that well. So whenever somebody takes the effort to write in and say, hey, we read through your stuff and I think this is wrong, I think that's a great outcome as well, right? I think it's worse if you don't get any sort of outreach, good or bad, because that means nobody's really taken the effort to read your stuff and form an opinion about it. So even if it's bad, I'm grateful that I've written about something that's at least prompted them enough to write in and say, hey, I think you were wrong. I'm like, thank you for your feedback. I appreciate it. If there's merit in what you're saying, I'll definitely go back and revise it. So, yeah, I think that's the way I look at it. It's important to be positive about the fact that somebody's reaching out to you, even if it's good or
Yeah.
bad.
Fair, fair. Now, looking at behind the scenes, right? What actually goes into creating a post? What's the typical tenure like? And then how do you pick the topics? What kind of research that you do? The reason why I'm asking is you have your day job. Now, on top of that, you're doing these things. So I just want to understand the kind of effort that you put in.
Yeah. So, honestly, when I started out, it was very tough because I didn't have any real opinion, right? So I had to do a lot of reading and research and writing for the articles to actually come out. Now I'm at a point where I've built up that repository of knowledge and research, right? It's all very properly documented in either Google Sheets or Docs or whatever, so I can keep going and referring to it and adding to it. So takes maybe a little less effort now, but at least end to end from finalizing on a topic to getting the final post out, which includes the slides, the LinkedIn post, the Substack, takes about 3 weeks. If it's something that I don't really know too much about, it could take even 1 month. Uh, there are multiple pieces normally I'm working on at the same time, just in terms of ideas, research, what is a possible, opinion that I could get out of this or a hypothesis that I want to work on. Um, so it normally stems from something that, either something's blown up. Like these days, stable coins, I'm working on something around stable coins because stable coins have really blown up. I'd written something about it 6 months ago. So it's like a follow on, right? But it can also be about something completely new that I don't know anything about, like AI. But I normally try to write about recent trends because that's also something that, people are interested in knowing more about. But yeah, the research, it'll either come up, either on my LinkedIn feed or I'll read something on Twitter. Something will come up, somebody's acquired somebody, or there's some data point where somebody says, hey, stable coins have now done, some trillions in value with it's in comparison to, let's say, a Visa or a MasterCard, things like that. And that'll at least prompt me to dive a little deeper. Just start, almost noting down some stats, saying, hey, this is what's happening, seeing if there's a pattern there. So, for example, when I'd written let's say I'd written a piece on, full stack, how UPI is becoming more full stack. It's just something that I'd been reading about over the last few weeks. And somewhere I was like, okay, it seems like a lot of companies at least acquiring, doing forward and backward integration. A lot of new acquisitions are suddenly happening in this space. Seems like there's a trend there. Let's dive in. So once I sort of have an idea that, hey, this is a topic I want to write about, it could be UPI or it could be cross border or stablecoins or app privacy or anything like that. Then I, approach it in a more structured fashion. Then you do your research, you read your reports. And then in the process of that is when the hypothesis is formed, right? What am I arguing for or what am I arguing against? And then once you have that hypothesis, which maybe takes about a week or about 10 days approximately, if you're spending like a couple of hours every day on it, once you have that, then the article writes itself. Then it becomes like a very, structured way saying, hey, this is what I'm arguing for. So I need to have these data points. I need to know what competitors are doing. I need to have a view on what this will look like in the future, things like that.
Yeah. So how frequently do you post?
So I honestly, ideally, I would love to do once a week where I get a new piece out every week. But it becomes tough, with the workload. And especially since I've recently joined a new role, uh,
Right.
getting that time to at least sit and think through some of these things becomes hard. But the target I at least keep is in a month between 2 to 4. Between getting out 2 to 4 pieces is a great target. The way I think about it is because I have a decent repository of work now, there are a lot of updates happening on the themes that I've already written about. So ideally, I'll do a repost of a previous piece with an update saying that, hey, I'd written about, let's say, fintech valuations. So this is at least the thesis I had, and this is how this has been updated. So that's a quicker turnaround because my thesis and my thoughts are already there, and it's just publishing an update. So during weeks or time periods when I don't have too much of time, that's the way I'd approach something normally. But getting out an original piece, at least 2 times a month is the target I'm chasing right now. We'll see. We'll see if I stick to it.
No, no, you will. You will. Um, s- so on a daily basis, right? How many hours you usually spend on these posts?
So I don't track it honestly on a daily basis. I track it more from a weekly perspective because it's very tough to predict the amount of work you get in a day. And if I keep a daily target and I miss it, then I probably don't feel great about myself. But I try to put in maybe 4 to 5 hours a week, and that can either be distributed across the week, or sometimes when I've not had any time during the week, then I'll just sit during Saturday and Sunday and really spend some time and deep dive onto a topic, or read reports and things like that. What I try to do is, at least you know Monday to Friday, keep an eye out on how some themes are trending. And I have like a Google sheet, or like on the notes app on my phone. I just keep typing down stuff saying, hey, I read this about something, seems like an interesting trend to explore. The toughest thing about writing is actually finding a topic that interests you enough to write about, or a theme that you want to continue exploring. And especially as you go deeper into things, a lot of this stuff becomes more and more specific. You can't keep it general anymore. Generally, everything's been written about, and people have an opinion on that. So yeah, once I have a theme, then it becomes easy. Then you just sit down and deep dive into the topic. But yeah, I think 4 to 5 hours a week is probably, I'd estimate it as a good number. More if I have time, but there are other things one is doing as well. So becomes tough to give more than that.
Yeah. And looking at your research, right? You mentioned that you do a combination of both primary as well as secondary research. How is that structured? You usually exploit the secondary resources out there and then you reach out to people, or how do you do that? And how do you reach out to people, right? Is it like cold calling, or you try to reach out through someone references? How does that happen?
So it starts off with a lot of secondary research. Now, at least in fintech, I'd say that I don't have to do too much of primary research because I understand the space well enough to at least have a view on how some of these things will play out. And at least in fintech, I do have that ecosystem, and I have folks around me who I have collabed with in the past. So I treat them as like my experts who I can really deep dive and get that perspective. And that's something that I feel I've done over the last year, where I've actually formed, I have a group of people who I enjoy collabing with, and, you know, who understand some of these things maybe better than me, or have a different perspective on it. There's a friend Chinmay, who works in AI. He's an AI engineer. So on anything AI or anything to do with privacy, I reach out to him. He's the guy who gives me, a lot of insights on how it's playing out, or connects me to people. But uh, a lot of primary research is just, cold reach outs. People are super helpful. I was actually surprised at the amount of responses I got, where you just ping somebody on WhatsApp, or you message somebody on LinkedIn, and you get a lot of folks who respond and say, hey, yeah, I'd love to talk about this. I'd love, get your views also on it as well. But I usually do that once I have that secondary research done, so that when I speak to them, then it can actually be understanding some of the nuances of this, and not just, doing understanding the basics, which can be done very easily now.
Right. So moving on, right? What do you think helped you stand out on LinkedIn? One thing that I can clearly notice is you kind of state your opinion, not just putting out the data points, but then using those data points, you draw out certain insights, and then thereby they'll help you form your opinion and you put that out there. That's one thing, right? Is there anything else that you feel helped you stand out on LinkedIn? That's my first question. The second question is, um, what are some of the do's and don'ts, right, for someone who is just beginning to, um, you know, creating posts out on LinkedIn? What are some of the do's and don'ts?
No, that's actually a good question. I'm also not sure, to be honest. Uh I think the biggest thing that's helped me stand out is and keeping opinions, etc., all of that to the side, right? I think at least I started doing it because I genuinely do enjoy the process of writing and thinking about some of this stuff, right? It's quite therapeutic almost for me, where you're sitting on a weekend, or sitting after work, you're maybe having some chai, and you're just thinking to some of the stuff. You're either writing in your notebook, or, jotting down some notes on your laptop. Uh, and because I really enjoy it, I really go into the depths of certain things, right? I just don't do it on the surface and say, okay, this is good enough to post and let's chase the likes and the follows and let's put it out there, which I feel a lot of people do. As a result, it's also tough to stay committed to it, right? If you do it just for the likes and the follows, at some point, you get a fewer likes, so you don't get follows and you get demotivated. Or that motivation has to come because you genuinely enjoy sitting down and, doing some of this stuff. So that's one thing that's I think the biggest thing that's actually helped me stand out. I enjoy it, so I go to the depths of it, and I guess somewhere people can see that I've really tried to, break down the topic to its fundamentals. Uh, the second piece is when I write, at least, right? I see it as a way of I see it as a privilege that people are reading my stuff. So when I write, I try to write in a way that says, hey, anybody who reads even half of this, they're taking time out from doing something else and spending time on this. So they should get that value. It's a privilege that somebody's reading, some of your content and taking the time to engage and writing into you and things like that. So really being cognizant of that somebody's taking their time out, reading it, giving you feedback. Yeah, I think those are the major things. Don't chase follows and likes. Really enjoy the process. Don't go after your likes and follows and becoming a quote unquote influencer. And respect the fact that people are taking time out and reading this. It's not that they could be doing something else. Why are they reading your pieces?
Fair, understood. All right. So, you mentioned earlier that Ambika, you usually collab with, folks, particularly for a topic where you're not that familiar with, right? Now, one of the posts that you created, especially on data privacy and then the app tracking, that we found it to be really interesting. And for our viewers, we will mention that link in the description. Why did you choose that topic? And then, for an average user, what are some of the measures that they should take?
Right. So I have been interested in the privacy space, just the data privacy piece. I've tried to deep dive into it. And I have a friend who I've collaborated with on the AI stuff as well. His name's Chinmay. He actually sent this article by this, I think he's an engineer called Prashant. His Substack is called PB. And he'd done a deep dive on how, at least on Android apps, a lot of these apps are silently querying other apps in the background. They're able to actually detect if this app is installed, and by detecting like multiple apps actually create a customer profile. So I was shocked. I had no idea this was happening. Uh, and we were actually discussing this. I'd met him. I'd met this friend for lunch, and we were actually discussing. I was like, listen, we have to write about this. I'm supposed to be in this tech space. How do I have no idea about this? And if I don't, then I know for sure that nobody does. So it started out as like, hey, let's do this investigative thing and actually deep dive and figure out what to do. And I just started writing, understanding more. And at some point, we were like, hey, let's analyze this for ourselves. So this Prashant, who had actually written this, had done a deep dive, but for Android apps. What he had not made very clear in his piece is how can an ordinary person like me or you actually check out for themselves, right? At the end of the day, you believe it when you see it with your own eyes. So that's where I actually, sat down, try to download the IPA or APK files from like my phone or my friend's phone, actually see if there's a way I can, go through the different files and see what permissions they're asking for, what apps are they detecting. And that's when Chinmay was like, hey, this is very complicated. Let me just build a tool for this. So one weekend we sat down. I was doing all this on my own, like in a more hacky way. He built this tool. We sort of just put it out, and I was surprised at the traction. I think the Ken probably read the PB article and my piece as well and took it and sort of ran with it, and it got a lot of attention, which was great. And it was actually surprising to know how many people didn't know this was happening. Right, for me, the biggest learning from that at least was, and the shock at least, right, that this is actually not covered even in the DPDPA Act. All of this stuff is not mentioned, which at this point I'm like, you take my phone number, take my phone number, take my creds, where all the fintech apps I'm on have probably taken it, sold it, done something with it. I don't care, right? I get 20 calls in a day from some loan app trying to sell me something. I'm like, it's fine. I'll just won't answer it. But this secondary level stuff, right? Where you're actually creating a profile and you're using it for I don't know what, you know, selling me stuff, or you're selling this profile to somebody else. In a way, you can actually influence policy making as well, right? That was that Cambridge Analytica thing. They
Yeah.
did that. They were able to actually influence the US election. So that stuff is very scary. You know, it's terrifying actually that apps are able to do that. And while some apps are probably better than others, a lot of apps don't really self-regulate. They're just doing this and we're letting them do it. Nobody's complaining because nobody knows about it. That was basically the point of the piece. That's why we wrote it. We said, hey, let's see if we can at least spread some awareness around it. um I think what a great outcome of it was, a lot of people actually reached out to me and said, hey, we followed the steps in your article and we've actually uninstalled a lot of these apps, or they've actually gone and extracted the file themselves, uploaded in the tool and seen all the permissions and all the apps that these apps were silently querying. So that was a great outcome. I think in terms of being more careful, it's one, make sure your apps are not, they don't have any permissions that they're taking either for your location or whatever else. A lot of this that is automatically switched on, so make sure you switch that off. The second is that there are a lot of people, you may be playing some game or you may be wanting some sort of Photoshop tool where you want to make a meme. Be very careful about what you're downloading. You've got a lot of these scam apps that you download. Some may even think, I've seen a lot of apps on the App Store. I'm like, who has built this and put this on this App Store? I don't know what somebody's getting out of it. But if you download these apps and they're getting a lot of this information, that is basically their business model, right? So yeah, I mean, I'd just say don't give your apps any permission beyond, the very basic stuff. Make sure when you're downloading something, you know what that app is doing, and you can do it either through steps followed, or you can you know, just talk to an AI tool and figure it out yourself. Delete it immediately if you're not using it. Yeah,
Uh,
that's basically what I'd say.
So, what are some of the apps that we use on a daily basis, right? That track rigorously, that take into account all the data points.
I think Zomato, I don't remember off the top of my head. I think Zomato, Blinkit, Zepto, a lot of these apps are querying like more than 50 apps in the background, right? Apple is a little more secure. And that was actually another problem for me. Apple is considered to be a premium phone. The Android phones are, at least, while they have a premium versions as well, Android at least has more models in the affordable range. And that was another point for me, right? I was like, is premium is now this is privacy a premium feature now? Like, is it only Apple folks who should be more secure? That should not be the case. There should be some way of checking it, right? This implicitly is covered under Europe's data laws. I think the problem is nobody knows this is happening. So if you don't complain, then nobody really, nips it in the bud.
Right.
So yeah, got your food delivery apps. A lot of loan apps do this. I think I'm not sure. Credit is one app that I think that's querying a lot of your innocuous apps in the background. Swiggy, I think, was very surprising to me. They're querying apps like First Cry, which is an app for, I think, baby clothes and things like that. So, it's seems like it doesn't matter, but it could actually be a very big indicator of if you have a kid or if you have an infant or not, right? And that can actually be fed into things like, what rate should I charge this person? Should I give them a loan? Should I give them this insurance? What should I, automating all those profiles. So yeah, that was, I mean, and that's a very small, I sampled only like 4 or 5 apps. I'd say actually there's the deep dive that PB has done. I've put it on a link in the article that I'd written. He's actually done this for, I think, more than 100 apps, but this is more in the Android side, where he's looked at, there's something called a manifest file in Android, where you have to declare all the apps that you're querying, and there's no limit to it. So what a lot of these apps, like let's say Zomato has done, is just quietly said, hey, we're querying all of these 1,000 apps. Nobody's really raised a complaint or, you know, really highlighted it to some sort of authority. So if you download these apps and you actually get access to that file, which he has done and he's published it publicly, you can actually see all the apps they're querying. And yeah, very, very shocking.
Understood. Great. So, shifting gears, pre-ISB, Ambika, you were into tennis, right? You took that up as a career. Um, what kind of drew you to tennis at such a serious level? And I just wanted to understand your inspiration and also your training regimen.
Right. So, I mean, when I got into tennis, it was more, I was a kid. My parents said, hey, we should probably put her in some sports. It'll be like an outlet for her energy. So I was in Delhi. They used to take me to Delhi Gymkhana Club. I used to just hit against the wall there. And I think somewhere some coach or one of the older gentlemen who play at these clubs saw me and said, hey, she looks like she has potential. Why don't you put her in structured training or a coaching program? And then they just put me in there. I was like 5 or 6. And then I just started going, for 1 hour every other day. Like you have those sessions, those coaching sessions that are set up. And then I started going for sessions and, you start entering those under 10, under 12 tournaments and I actually started doing well. And a lot of coaches at least said, hey, she's athletic, she seems to have the right skill set. Um, she seems to at least be enjoying this. So, keep at it. And that's how it really grew. It wasn't it, at that age, I didn't really know if I wanted to do this or not. I was just going because my parents are like, hey, I've put you in this tournament, go play. Or, hey, there's this coaching session, just go finish your session and come back. I did enjoy running around. I did enjoy sports. I playing football and basketball at that age. So this was just one more sport that I was doing. And then I think at some point when I was 10 or 11, I actually started getting pretty good results. I started getting noticed at least by a lot of national coaches where they said they'd actually come to my parents. And my parents also didn't know anything, right? Nobody in my family's actually played sport at the level I did. So you don't really know at what point, is your kid good and should they pursue this full time or not. Uh, so yeah, I mean, I was lucky at about 14. I got uh my coach. I found my coach Vishal. So his name's Vishal Uppal. He used to be a former Davis Cupper for India. He's won medals. He's represented India internationally. And I think he was really the guy who sort of guided me and, made sure I reached where I did in tennis. But that I think is really important, right? Finding the right coach who you align with. There are different coaching methods and there are different ways of training a person. For me, his coaching ideology really, I think, mirrored how I wanted to pursue sport, which really helped. And yeah, that's when I started pursuing it professionally. Not professionally, obviously, at 14, but with the goal to at least make it as a professional player. That guidance really helped. In terms of training regimen, I mean, I look back and I'm like, I don't know how I did it. Uh, it was pretty tough. But at that time, I think when you're doing it day in and day out for years, it seems pretty. You don't know anything else. Let's see. I used to get up at 6, have breakfast, reach the courts at 7. You have maybe a 2.5 hour training session on the court. And then you have like an hour of just fitness, right? Which would just be court drills, or you go to the track and you whatever, you run sprints or you run for an hour or whatever else. So from 7 to probably 10:30 is the morning session. Um, and then you go, you rest, you have lunch, and then you're back on the court at like 2 or 3, depending on if it's winter, you probably reach the court later. Earlier, if it's summer, then you probably reach later. And then yeah, again a 2.5 hour session in the evening, just on the court. And then you go for a weight. You do your weight training for about 45 minutes to an hour. And after that, get back home, have dinner. You're asleep by 9:30, 10. And I used to do that for 6 days a week. So Monday to Friday were 2 sessions, and Saturday was only a morning session. So we used to get a day and a half off during the week. When you were approaching tournaments, then it would become a little easier where you start tapering off, where you're still doing 2 sessions, but instead of doing like 3-4 hour sessions in the morning and evening, you're probably doing a session in the morning, a session in the evening. And then by the time you approach the tournament, you're probably doing 1 session a day. But yeah, that was at least the regimen. I don't know how I did it. I mean, I look back now at this point, like doing an hour workout a day tires me out. So
Yeah. But then how did you balance out your academics, right? Your studies with your training? Obviously, you would have focused more on training, but then how did you balance it out?
right. Yeah, so I honestly, there was not too much of balance to be very honest. By I mean, I was homeschooled for grades 11 and 12. I was just playing tennis full time. Even before that, I would go to school for exams, but that's it. I was not really studying or doing anything. I have a sister who was doing her exams. I have a twin sister, so she at least helped me out with a lot of her notes and things like that. But I mean, I was not really focused on academics at all. So when people say that balance and all of that, right? I don't think I had that. I was just doing tennis full time.
Hmm. Got it. And then what happened? At what point in time did you decide that, okay, let's leave tennis out and then move on to other things?
Right. So yeah, the goal was always to, I think, turn pro. And at least the way I was performing I mean, I was top 5 in India, I was top 200 in the world. So early indicators of at least that I had what it took. I had the potential, at least potential to, actually becoming a real is another step. So I got a scholarship to the States. I was at the University of Tennessee for 2 years to play tennis and then, also get a degree. And then I was at Nicholls State University in Louisiana for another 2 years. So college tennis is actually a way for a lot of young folks to turn pro, where you basically go for 4 years and you play full time there, right? While you're also studying there. That there's no such thing, honestly, in a US university. Uh, if you go there as a student athlete, you're going there to play sports. So the thought was that, hey, I'll do 4 years of college tennis and then, you know, go on tour for a couple of years, play like your lower level ITFs, and then see what happens, right? If there are results and you start performing well, then you commit to it and you stay on. Otherwise, we figure out what to do. That didn't really play out the way I thought it would. I got injured in my freshman year. I tore my rotator cuff. Uh, I had to have surgery, and the recovery process took a lot of time. When I came back, I think I came back early. I didn't rehab too well. So I tore it again. And then I was told that I would have to probably have another surgery. So at that point, I was already 20, 21, and it it would probably have taken me another year or so to recover, come back, be fully fit. And then after that, building up again. I was already like a few years behind my peers, and tennis is a sport, right? Like by the time you're 26, 27, you've reached your peak. After that, it becomes tough to sustain just because the load it takes on your body. Obviously, you have outliers like Federer, Nadal, who've played till they're 35, 40, but on average, 28 to 30 is considered old for a pro. So I was like, hey, I'm already 21. It's going to 2021. It's going to take me a couple of years at least to go back to where I was originally, right? Forget adding those extra levels to where I want to be playing. And at that point, my relationship with tennis also was not good, right? With injuries and things like that. I was just not in a good place. So I was like, hey, let's just at least forget about it. I don't want to do this tennis thing anymore. So that's when I came back. And then for about 2, 3 years, I worked in a sports startup. I didn't really know what to do after tennis. So I worked in a sports startup. I thought, hey, if I can't play, let me at least, um, work in it. And then, yeah, I figured out what I wanted to do. After 3 years, realized keep don't want to work in sports in India. It's a very murky, place to be. It's not very well structured. And figured, okay, let's go do an MBA and figure things out. And then that's how I landed up at ISB.
Got Great. So, Ambika, you were mentioning that how the entire sports ecosystem in India is a bit more unstructured, right? Just wanted to understand the support system that the athletes get in India and the challenges that these folks face.
Right. So I think the major issue with the sports system in India, at least, is apart from cricket, right, where BCCI is obviously a really rich league, and with IPL and everything, there's a very structured way for somebody to make it as a sports person. Even if you don't make it to the top 1%, right, where you're playing for India and you're a Kohli, you're a Virat Kohli or Rohit Sharma, you still can play Ranji and have a good career, right, which it's a pretty high level to be. And that system at least doesn't exist for other sports in India, right? You only make money and you can only pursue it as a career if you reach, the level of, let's say, a Sindhu or a Saina Nehwal, right? And that should not be the case. To actually have a structured sports ecosystem, you have to give opportunities for maybe the top 10, 15% of players, right? You have to have those rungs. Like if you look at the EPL, you've got like the different levels, right? EPL is right at the top, and you've got your Championship League, League One, so on and so forth. So that every player at their own level is able to at least pursue sport as a full-time career or a part-time career in some cases if the league is, closer to the bottom rungs. That doesn't really exist in India. And I think a major reason for that is that there's no concept of private leagues, private sports leagues. All the sports leagues that are there in India are very closely connected with the government and the sports federations. So when these guys are dictating it, it becomes very hard for an independent entity to create a structure that best suits all the stakeholders. I'll give you an example. I was at this company called Sports Live, and we had the rights to the Premier Badminton League, where we conceptualized and executed the league. So we got the rights from the Badminton Association of India. And then we would, sell the media rights to, let's say, a Star Sports. We'd sell the franchisees to team owners. We'd, get players onboarded, both Indian and international. What the rights from the BAI, the Badminton Association, gave us is that we were the exclusive league of BI. So we had exclusive rights to the players, and then BI would work with us to get some of the top international players to also be part of the league, right? The challenge here is that, you have to you have to create or structure the league in such a way that everybody makes money, right? The way it was structured is that you'd pay a certain licensing fee every year to the Badminton Association, which would be in the crores. And the rest of the league, the franchises, the central league, they would not end up making money, which is fine for the first few years, but there was no path to profitability either, right? The league itself gave a lot of opportunities to players, right? One, you had a lot of top international players coming and being in India for a month and playing with our own players, right? So they were seeing the type of training and the type of quality that you have to bring out to actually win at the top level. They'd also get more comfortable. There's a lot of intimidation at those top levels, but you are in the same team with that player, you're sort of traveling with them day in and day out, and that intimidation also reduces. You start seeing them and you say, hey, they're just another player. Also, in terms of the money these guys were getting, right? A lot of, at least the players, the upcoming players, the league was paying them 50, 60 lakhs to play, like, maybe 7, 8 matches over the course of 3 to 4 weeks. That's a big amount, and for a lot of players, this would actually enable them to, take care of their families. So they could play with less stress, maybe hire another physio, hire a better trainer, do all of that stuff. So, and we were doing all that because we wanted to take care of the players, but a lot of private leagues are not able to really do that, because they don't have the funding, because it's so closely associated with the government. We tried raising money also, but the issue is a lot of folks who run these sports federations, right, also occupy very senior levels in the government, right? Somebody who is the president of, let's say, the boxing federation or the badminton federation or, snooker federation, whatever it is, will also be somebody who's a pretty big person in the Indian government. And
Yeah.
that means that when you raise money, right, you can't really commit and say, hey, I have these rights for 10, 20 years. Everybody is looking for investment in sports, right? In India, internationally, you've got international players who put money into IPL teams. That's because IPL is more structured and it operates almost like a private league. When we'd go to raise money, funds would say, okay, can you guarantee that I will have these rights for 20 years? We said, listen, we can't. As long as this government is in power, you have these rights. Now, that can be for 5 years, that can be for 10 years. We don't know. So all of those challenges exist. And then there's just obviously general sports infrastructure, right? Just stadiums are not there, training facilities are not there. Anybody can today get up and become a coach. There's no sort of way to say, okay, who is a good coach? Do they have to give some exam? Do they have to have a license? All of that. So all of that, together, it doesn't give a lot of support to players. Then, of course, you've got, players like, and I mean, Dangal illustrates this really well, right? This movie where the guys like Keel, I earned medals for my country, but I couldn't earn money. There's especially, grassroots sports such as like your boxing, wrestling, things like that. Once you achieve a certain level, you get a government job, but then you're in that government job and there's no path to really grow there. Alternatively, folks who've gone the academic route, and they will probably end up in 20 years doing better than you. So at some point, somebody's like, hey, I played sports, and you're not sort of giving me that value or, using the skill set that I have. to actually be able to contribute. And that's something that I think Gopi also said in one of the podcasts, right, which I resonated with, that, hey, listen, uh, it it it's you're better off just going the academic route, because then in 20 years you'll be able to actually reach that level of success that you may not get if you play sports and you fail at it, right? I think the concept of giving the failed sports person in India a safety net is not there. And that's where he says that, hey, you need to have, the funds, you need to have a family who's able to back you, so you can, leverage that if sports doesn't go the way you plan. And that's what happened for me, right? I had a family who supported me. So when tennis didn't work out, I did get the opportunity to go and work for 2-3 years and take that time to figure out what I wanted to do. I did get the opportunity to go to ISB. Nobody gave me an opportunity because I played sports. And, this is something that it really infuriates me, because you see a lot of, top level CXOs who they come on podcasts and they say, yeah, we love to hire athletes and they have a lot to give and there's this skill set and that skill set, but it doesn't translate to uh, actual, the hiring process. So when I was applying for jobs when I came back to India as well, I was like, okay, I'm maybe a little behind in the academic piece, but I've played sports and at least you see a lot of this, where people are like, yeah, we want to hire sports persons. That never moved the needle for me, ever.
Hmm.
Right? So, all of these things, somewhere, you can talk about it at the top level. It needs to translate both in corporate, in government as well. And that's how actually a lot more people get to sports. That's how you'll give people the support that they need. By saying that, hey, even if you fail, there's still a path to success. It's not that if you fail, then you just get rid of this one job and then you stuck here.
Sure. So you kind of agree with Gopi Chand that, only pursue sports as a career if you are rich. So you kind of agree with that statement, at least taking into account the current set of conditions.
Yeah, for sure. Like, it's it's not more from I think the way he's meant it also is that ki, if you pursue it and you don't have the means or you don't have a safety net to fall back on, right, you'll end up regretting going the sports way. I think to avoid that regret, it's better if you go into academics. You can't really go and play for a country or put yourself out there and play with you know and put everything on the line, and always in the back of your head there's like, hey, what if I fail? Then there's no other option for me, or I'll just be stuck because there's no route for me to use this sports experience and actually add it to you know use it to maybe excel in another field. That system only is not set up in India today. I'd say it's way better structured in the US or Europe, right? People respect that. In India, there's still that respect is not there. So I mean, for sure, I think I definitely agree with him. And he's also saying it because he's training players day in and day out. He sees he sees what they go through when they're not making it and they're realizing, hey, what do I do now? And that's really a terrible space to be in. I mean, I went through it and I had, the backing of my family. I knew that, hey, if this doesn't work out, then I still can go the academic route. So yeah, it's very traumatic, I think, for a lot of sports players. And until that's not fixed, we're not going to be that that sports country and win medals at the Olympics, like, and compare ourselves to China and the US. We're never going to meet that level if we don't fix this structure right now.
Yeah. And don't you think the situation is improving a bit or it's still the same? When you pursued your career as a sportswoman, right? Comparing it now, you think the situation has changed?
It's getting better, right? It's not that it's not improved. It's definitely gotten better. I think there's no more focus now on non-cricket sports. There's more awareness around this. Uh, does it need to get better? Yes. Does it need to be faster? Also, yes. But but I definitely won't say it's in the same state that it was before. I still think though a lot of these things could move faster. For example, this concept of like private leagues, right? Or creating a system for folks who maybe didn't make it into sports, provide them a way into corporate at a systemic level, right? Not key personally, I took the effort and I took the initiative and I got into corporate after maybe not making it in sports. All of these things, they've been discussed. They've been discussed for the last 20 years. Every time the Olympics comes, we get maybe one or two medals. Then a discussion starts saying, hey, why are we so poor compared to other countries? What do we need to do? And then it fades away. Right? Somewhere we need to keep that momentum going and realize that, hey, we need to actually do this. Otherwise, it'll go, and maybe in 20 years it'll become better. But why 20 years, right? Why not in the next 5 years? We know what's wrong. We know what to fix. We're just not doing it, or we're not putting the processes in place so that it'll happen in the next 5 years.
Sure. Ekya, what to you?
Yeah, sure.
So, Ambika, shifting gears a little bit here. Like one theme that I can consistently see all through your career is that you have been multitasking almost pretty much all your life. Earlier it was sports and academics, and now it's your job, your posts on LinkedIn as an influencer, and also, I mean, even though we did not cover it as much detail in the podcast, your interactions with VC space per se. How do you do it? I mean, like, what we really want to know is how do you really balance pursuing your passion at the same time keeping up with your own full-time job?
Right. So I think honestly, the main thing is actually it's just being very disciplined, I think. And a lot of people think it's counterintuitive. They think, hey, if you're very disciplined and you say, hey, I have to do these 5, 6 things, it actually doesn't give you that freedom to do a lot. But I was actually watching an interview by Venus Williams. She's a very celebrated tennis player, obviously. And she, at least I echoed and resonated with a lot what she said. She's like, hey, if you have a very disciplined and structured way of doing what you need to do, it leaves you free to pursue a lot of things that you want to do after that, right? And that's at least how I approach it. I'll take like a weekly target or a monthly target. And we talked about this a little bit, right? Where I said, hey, every month I want to take out at least 2 to 4 original posts. So that same way, I at least try to put a target and say, hey, in this month, these are my targets, at least in terms of the startups I want to speak to, or the outcomes I want, at least in my interactions with the VC world. These are the outcomes that I want, at least from my professional work. So when you have those targets at a monthly or weekly level, you're able to chase that and then work everything around it. So, for example, I may say, hey, this week for sure, I need to get an article out. And I know how much time it takes. Or this week, I say, hey, I need to speak to at least 2, 3 startups. It's been pending and I need to, speak to them, get my notes out, form an opinion on them, all of that. Once you have a target, then you work backwards from there. And then you say, okay, every day between 7 to 8, I'll sit down, I'll take this time out, and I'll do some work. Right? So that's the only way to do it. The problem I think arises, people struggle to multitask, is when they don't allocate the time, or they don't have those targets to chase and work backwards from there. When you say, okay, if I have time today, then I'll do it, then it becomes very, if I have time, maybe okay, I'm also tired, okay, I'll do it tomorrow. You're not really holding yourself accountable. So that's the way I look at it. At least I know different people have different ways of at least managing this. That's how I do it.
The discipline that you have, right? You think it's got to do something with you being in sports? What are some of the learnings that you took from being a sportswoman?
Yeah, for sure, right? I think that discipline of saying, hey, every day you wake up, you show up, you get this stuff out of your way. This is the target that you're chasing. Every week you want to get a little bit better. Definitely, that's something 100% I've learned from sports. Um, Other learnings I think from sports is, and this is something my coach Vishal actually told me, and this is something I try to at least live by. So when I was younger, at least, you play a lot of matches, and I used to be affected, especially when you're young, right? You get affected a lot when you lose a match or you win a match. At that point, a lot of your self worth is actually tied to how you played that particular day, right? And then I remember I lost a match and I was feeling really terribly about it, and I was like, oh, this is the end of the world, and I'm the worst player in the world. And he was like, listen, you have to follow two things. You have to put in the effort and you have to have a good attitude. Like those are the two things. And then if you do that, if you put in effort day in and day out, if you generally have a good attitude on more days than you have a bad attitude, then things will work out the way you want them to, right? You'll see good things happen. So that's one major learning that I've at least tried to do, even in my professional life, even with my writing, anything else that I do, that if you're putting in the effort and you have a good attitude, good things will happen. So that's another thing from sports, right? And I'd say finally, I think just the ability to deal with failure. I think that's something at least a lot of people don't face that much in the corporate world. Not day in and day out. Like obviously you'll have good days and bad days, but with sports at least I mean, so tough about it is that you're playing hundreds of matches, right? A year, and through your career, you'll play thousands. And it's not ambiguous. It's not that, hey, it's not like, hey, you go into a meeting and these were some good outcomes and these were some bad outcomes, right? It's very binary. You lost or you won. So you either failed or you succeeded in a way, right? So I think the ability to deal with that and, have a perspective on it, saying, hey, just because you lost a match or just because there's a bad outcome, it doesn't mean it's a failure. uh, it's a process, right? As long as you took something out of it, you learned something from it, and you obviously won't feel like that at that time. It's easy to say that in retrospect, but as long as you put in the effort, you maybe worked on something, uh, uh, you got a little bit better. That's a good outcome as well. That's a success as well. A lot of people, I think, see success as somewhere that you reach and you say, okay, I'm successful. I don't think that's the case. It's like it's a process, right? Every day you get a little bit better. Today, what was a success for you may not be a success in 2 years or 3 years. So yeah, really enjoying the process, knowing that, success or failure, it's a process. It's not somewhere that you have to reach and say, okay, I've arrived. I am now a successful person. So yeah, everything I think I do today, or at least the person who I am, a lot of these things are defined by playing sports.
Oh, got it. I think one very good way to summarize it could be like success is a journey rather than a destination. A women.
Sure.
So Ambika, you have almost come towards the end of this podcast. I only have one question for you. So your life has actually been very different if you compare your pre-MBA life to your post-MBA life. The pre-MBA life was much more unstructured, had a lot of uncertainty. Now you are in a more of a stable career, you have a career trajectory to look forward to. If you were to give one message to your pre-MBA self, what would that be?
I think stay curious. I think especially in today's day and age, it's very important to be curious, constantly look at improving yourself, however much that may be, right? I think a lot of people think that you have to get it up and give 100% every day. That's true, but every day you may not have 100% to give, right? Sometimes, some days you get up and you have 20% to give, and that is your 100% for that day, right? So just remembering that. I think also not to be too anxious. I think at least pre-MBA, everybody gets super anxious and says, hey, placements, my career, my wherever I get, that's going to define the rest of my life. I think broadly, and I was caught up in that a little bit myself, but I think broadly, 3-4 years down the line, everybody is where they want to be, or at least they're happy to be. And that takes time to figure out. And we don't see it when we're in that pre-MBA place. But you know, 5 years down the line, I'm like, yeah, I'm happy that I'm here. I figured out what I want to do. I can see myself at least being in this space for the next 5-6 years. So yeah, I think being patient with yourself, not being too anxious. And, I think just that effort and attitude thing is something that I wish more people knew, that, just show up, put in the effort, have a reasonably positive attitude. I know it's tough to have a positive attitude every day, but good things will happen if you just stay with the process. Yeah, I mean, that's mostly it, I think. Those are the things that I try to follow even today.
Yeah, wonderful. I think that's a really good note to end this discussion with. Thank you so much, Ambika, for joining us today. Really, really appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Andika. Bye.
Thank you.